Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of Inlay Terms. I'm your host, Payman Ascari. My guest today is Dr. Matthew Cockle. I'm going to go ahead and introduce him shortly. We're having some audio delays, so my audio is maybe 3-second delayed on Dr. Cockle's side or vice versa. So I will say hello, welcome, Dr. Cockle. How are you doing? And also, please launch into our topic today, which is the concern surrounding the erosion of democracy and the erosion of rights. Take it away, sir.
Thank you, Payman. So I'm in BC, and here in British Columbia, we're faced with a flurry of new legislation. There are some enormous bills that have come through in the past 2.5 years, starting with the Emergency and Disaster Management Act, and then there was the Health Professions and Occupations Act, and then there was the Legal Professions Act. And currently, there's a great deal of controversy surrounding a new bill that's being proposed, Bill 7, by David Eby, who is the Premier of British Columbia. And, you know, these bills passed into act, these three bills, they stand out partly because they completely flaunt the processes of democratic lawmaking. To begin with, there's no transparency, and transparency is essential in democratic systems. Now, there are rules for lawmaking in democracies, in liberal democracies, and one of them is notice to the public and to those concerned, and information needs to be provided, enough information that these proposed laws, the changes to the law, can be discussed, can be debated, there can be public participation, expressions of dissent, assent, and there has to be meaningful consultation. So we're in a representative democracy. We vote for people who then vote on things like laws. But for that representative democratic system to be effectively democratic, the people that we vote for, they have to listen to what we have to say. And so part of the legislative process is consultation, and consultation with the people affected. So in the case of the Health Professions and Occupations Act, obviously consultation would have to be with health professionals. And in the case of the Legal Professions Act, it would have to be with the legal professionals, with the lawyers. And then finally, there has to be consent. There has to be public consent. And that's sticky because it's a representative democracy. So if people vote in the legislative assembly at the provincial level, then that's tacit consent of the population. But in the case of the HPOA, the Health Professions and Occupations Act, and in the case of the Legal Professions Act, our elected representatives didn't get the opportunity to properly read and debate that legislation in the Legislative Assembly before votes were forced. In the case of the HPOA, only a third was read and debated. And in the case of the Legal Professions Act, only 9%. Then you have a vote that is forced, and you have the party members who show up voting in one direction, and there I'm referring to the NDP, the governing party. Well, if everybody who shows up in your party is voting in one direction and they haven't read the legislation, that gives the impression of a whipped vote. That is a vote where the members of the Legislative Assembly, our representatives, the people that we've elected, that they're being pressured by their party to vote along party lines. Well, that's not democratic. And so these three bills that became act, that were passed into act, they're developed improperly, and they were passed improperly. And that's not even getting into all of the ways in which this legislation writes infringement. So writes the infringement of rights and freedoms into law. And I think that British Columbians should see this legislation as an open attack upon their rights and freedoms, and an open flaunting of democracy. And that's a real problem. And it goes to transparency. And so what maybe we need to think about what transparency means. And I can just refer to something that a friend of mine wrote to me recently, a little passage in one of her emails. And she's Gail Davidson, I'm referring to, who is a specialist in international human rights law. So transparency means it's an essential requirement that an essential requirement of lawmaking, that the process, the content, the parties, the advisors, the discussions, the identity of decision makers, the information upon which decisions are made, the public consultation carried out, the debates held, the experts consulted, all of this has to be in the open. It has to be open. It has to be available for the public to know or to know about. Because without transparency, you can't have meaningful participation in governance. And without transparency, you can't have accountability. And what is the opposite of transparency? It's secrecy. And that's the hallmark of dictatorial regimes, and it's anathema to democracy. And so here in BC, we're dealing with this. It's a real problem. And of course, we're also dealing with it at the federal level. And I think many people are aware that, besides crushing lawful protest, the Ottawa protests, invoking emergency wartime measures to strip Canadians of their right to dissent. Obviously, that's an anti-democratic action on the part of our federal government. Freezing bank accounts. No one in the world thinks that this is acceptable behavior for leaders within a democracy. But there are less glaring examples, and one of them is the practice within Trudeau's government. And I hesitate to call it Trudeau's government because it seems more appropriate to call it perhaps Chrystia Freeland's WEF party, because the agenda that it's advancing, it doesn't seem to have much to do with Canadian concerns, but it certainly does align with globalist agendas. Now, the Trudeau-Freeland government, they passed a great many laws in secret. And maybe Canadians don't know that that's possible because we have a parliament. We have parliament at the provincial level. We have parliament at the federal level. That's our MLAs. They're members of the Legislative Assembly where laws are passed. And then we have our members of parliament. And laws are passed at the federal level there. But laws can also be passed as secret orders in council. And these laws are protected. And one excuse might be that this is a matter of national security. Of course, now how is that going to be defined? Does that include economic measures? Are those matters of national security? In the case of the Trudeau government, it seems that at least one of these secret orders in council had to do with the way in which terrorism is defined. So broadening the scope of this term so that you could perhaps bring in things like protest. And well, that again, that's anti-democratic. So how many? The last time I checked, the number was up to 72 secret orders in council. That's a great deal of legislation. That's a lot of laws being passed in secret, and these are laws kept secret not only from the public, but from the rest of Parliament that are not included in this small council. So these are very concerning indications that our government is not inclined to abide by established democratic procedure when it comes to lawmaking. Now, what do we do about that? Well, we've got to be informed, firstly, as Canadians, and then we have to find ways to pressure our representatives. I know that in Penticton, an MP in Penticton, Dick Cannings, he's been an MP for a long time, and this is a man who it is very hard to get him to answer you by mail or by telephone. You can't drop in to the office. It's still closed. It was closed during COVID, but it's remained closed. And this is a man who he posts a great deal about bird watching, which is wonderful. Recently, I saw one of his posts on the Meadowlark Festival in the Okanagan, and that's a great. The Meadowlark Festival, what a wonderful thing. But we need people to start reviewing what happened during the pandemic and to look at the systematic violation, the systematic infringement of Canadians' rights and freedoms. And it's not enough for our elected representatives to say, well, in Canada, we actually have a very weak charter. We don't have a constitution like the Americans, and you can use the notwithstanding clause in the charter, and as long as you have a reason that is considered reasonable and in line with democratic values, then your rights and freedoms can be suspended. Well, it's true that the charter is weak, but we have derogable rights that can be suspended in certain very clear parameters, and then there are non-derogable rights that can't be suspended even in wartime, even in a pandemic. And these rights are protected by many international human rights law treaties to which Canada is signatory. And so it isn't actually true that all of our rights can simply be suspended, following, this notwithstanding clause. That's not the case. One of the things that we need in Canada, I think, is we need a shift in the way we understand freedom. Partly the problem is that Canadians' identity has been cultivated in opposition to the identity of the American people. And so if the American identity is focused around freedom, then Canadians shy away from that idea. They don't want to appear like the brash and arrogant American who simply asserts himself. But there are many ways to conceive of freedom, and I think that the essential is to recognize that freedom isn't the freedom to go shopping or the freedom to plan your next trip to Thailand, and having the ability to purchase things and to own property. Of course, that's important. And having access to a free market, it's incredibly important. And being able to go and see the world and enjoy life, these are essentials. But freedom becomes meaningful when we decide to take on responsibilities vis-a-vis others. And from the very beginning, that's part of the definition of liberal democracy. So now we kind of swim about in terms where we've lost the understanding of some of the ideas that structure the world around us in important ways. So liberal democracy, there's two words there, liberal and democracy. And democracy, that's demos, the people, and krati, that's rule, so it's rule of the people. And liberal, it refers to the quality of the Latin word liberalis, and that's the quality of a free human being, someone worthy of their freedom, and or something worthy of Hi there. Are we back?
Dr. Cockle. Yes, sorry, you were talking, so you said democracy, what it means, and then liberal. You were on liberal.
Yes. So we just had a power outage here. We're on a micro hydro system, and suddenly it went out, and the router is attached to that. So now I'm on my phone's hotspot. But if you lose me again, it will be because my laptop has died. That may happen. So liberalis, something befitting a free person. And so really liberal democracy is about free people engaging in their own governance. So taking responsibility for what happens in your backyard. When we say politics, we think, oh, it's just gangsterism, and so we shouldn't be involved. Well, it is gangsterism when you look at what's happening in Canada right now. That is what it looks like. And you've got this incredible amount of pressure on politicians. We don't know why. Why is Carney lobbying the mayor of Beijing a week before taking a position as prime minister? Why does David Eby have a CCP advisor who seems to be presenting talking points in relation to Eby that are completely contradictory to what Eby is saying in the Chinese press in the Lower Mainland? That's odd. There are pressures here that are not appropriate. But politics, the proper way to think of politics is it's just the polis. It's the state, it's the city, your town. And so politics is you take responsibility for what happens in your backyard. And that's democracy. We rule. But you've got a corporate agenda, and you've got incredibly powerful individuals now. The billionaire class is just the beginning of it, and perhaps they've grown frustrated with democratic process and with the irritants of regulatory processes, and they've been allowing us crumbs, and maybe now they're going to say, well, no more crumbs for you. You're going to have nothing, and you're going to be happy. That's a slogan from one of the WEF's advertisements, which is now difficult to find online, but it did appear at one point. And, freedom in Canada, we have this passive sense that everything's okay, and we just have to not raise a fuss, and things will be given to us as long as we're polite. And that's just not the way it works. Freedoms are taken, they're not given. And right now they're being taken away from us. And, it's not enough just to write letters. Not that Canadians are in the habit of writing letters to their MLAs, MPs, and senators. But I know from personal experience, with respect to C-293, a terrible bit of anti-democratic legislation that was being pushed through at the federal level, did a great deal of research on that and prepared material, and I drafted a letter to the senators because it had passed the first house, and I believe I sent 120 of these letters, and I added to each one a paragraph, handwritten, and different each time, with my thoughts. And it took me 3.5 days. It was important, and within democracy, our main tool for democracy is speech, is cordial discussion, debate. The whole process depends upon consultation. And to those 120 letters, I received one reply from an intern. And that's a curious indication of how inclined our elected representatives are to engage with constituents. And I know that the dozens and dozens of times I've contacted David Eby over the past few years, I haven't heard anything back from him. And that's particularly surprising since I had gone into his office and spoke to him at length while he was still Attorney General. And I'd spoken to him on another occasion when we ran into each other in the Point Grey area. So, I mean, that speaks to, that speaks to our representatives not wanting to engage with the public, not wanting to engage with the people. Well, but it's a democratic system. The people rule. And that's what is being taken away from us. And quite quickly. And BC is leading the charge in terms of Canadian provinces. The passage of legislation in BC is incredibly concerning. For instance, with the Emergency and Disaster Management Act, you can have an emergency declared in relation to a whole number, forest fires, all the things that you would expect, but also as the result of a prescribed event. And the word prescribed in this legislation, it can mean anything. If the minister says this type of event is prescribed, then that can trigger emergency powers. And those emergency powers, they include special measures. And the special measures can be prescribed actions. So again, that leaves a great deal of room for invention. And in case that's not broad enough, so the minister or his administrators can do any prescribed action for any prescribed reason. You also have non-emergency emergencies called critical incidents, which themselves can be prescribed events and call for prescribed actions. And in terms of protocols, well, the minister has the power to make them up on the fly. So there, this legislation, and on top of it, there's no clear legitimate purpose given for this legislation. And that means that if rights infringements happen, then after the fact, when the court is examining it, you can't point to the required purpose and say, look, it was designed to do this, but there's overreach and it was doing this other thing. So by not including legitimate purpose required in a democracy for lawmaking, that legislation builds into itself protections against later review, as though part of the intention was to normalize and legitimize rights infringements. And that's another principle of democracy that's being attacked. Liberal democracy is built up around the importance of individual rights and freedoms. And throughout the declared pandemic, that's what was being attacked. That's what was being taken away. So, your right to information, your right to movement, your right to choose work, your right to religious belief and freedom of assembly, your right to freedom of expression. There was a tremendous amount of charter protected rights that were being infringed. You would think that our judges, who are the guardians of rule of law in a democracy, that our independent judiciary, because the judges in a democracy like ours, in a parliamentary democracy, it's very important that you have division of powers between the legislative branch of government that makes laws, the executive branch that passes them and that administers them, that pushes them out into the administrative state, into institutions like the Public Health Agency of Canada, for instance, and administers these laws. And then the judiciary, which reviews the laws, which is there to ensure that they're not infringing rights and freedoms. Well, that didn't happen during the declared pandemic. And you would think now, looking back at the rights infringements that happened and at all the challenges in the courts, you would think, well, at least now our judges will be looking at this properly, and maybe we can sort of correct this so that this kind of terrible society-wide infringement, abusive, coercive measures and abusive infringements of rights doesn't happen again. But the judicial review process has not been carried out in a diligent or ethical manner by our courts. And there are a number of reasons for that. One reason is the use of administrative law principles to get around the judicial review process. So formerly, it would have been an elected representative, a minister who was in charge of pandemic response. But in this case, there was a change made, and we had public health authorities, that is, non-elected, appointed administrators put in charge of these things. And what that means for the judicial review process is the scope of review is very much narrowed. They are protected in a way that our elected representatives aren't. And so, very simply, when you are questioning the decisions of a public health officer like Bonnie Henry, you are lawyers who are bringing valid constitutional challenges. They're saying, look, you close the churches, and that infringed people's right to freedom of religion and freedom of assembly. And even churches where they were maintaining 6-foot distance rules and masking, not that those were valid policies, but they were being maintained. And so a clear charter violation, and at a time when Walmart was open to the public and gyms were open to the public. But why is this not going forward? Well, using administrative law principles, it seems that they can limit the scope of review to something called the record of the proceedings. So if Bonnie Henry didn't consult certain expert evidence, if she was unaware or didn't consult it, then it can't be brought in to show that her decisions were mistaken or baseless. The only thing that can be brought in is what Bonnie Henry herself was looking at, and she gets to decide, the administrator gets to decide what material is brought in against her. That means essentially that you cannot bring in expert witness testimony from immunologists and virologists to demonstrate that the thing she was maintaining or the public health orders she was making were in fact incorrect or lacking scientific foundation. So that expert witness testimony gets excluded. Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm just going on.
No, it's okay. I actually wanted to not stop you, but before going down that road, I know where you're going. I want to ask you a question. This is going to be a tough question. I met this couple by a cliffside, 85 years old. They were just overlooking the ocean. I had a chat with them. Their concern is, taking a walk in the park, going for a hike. These are the people that got, they got the vaccine, they received it. They were not really negatively impacted by the restrictions, and actually they supported it. The government kept them safe. How do you convince these people that want to be governed in this fashion, that want safety and security, because they don't care about freedom, they care about going to the park, the hike, camping? How do you convince them that no, this is a threat?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is the problem that we're faced with. As Canadians, we're used to a very comfortable lifestyle, and we want to be able to spend time skiing, and we want to take vacations, and we certainly don't want to invest a huge amount of time in political activism and advocacy and volunteering. Most of us don't have time for this or the bandwidth. But I think that a lot of people, maybe they're not ready to hear it. But when you look at the 20th century and you look at the transition into authoritarianism that occurred in a great many countries, that transition is always made through appeals, successive appeals to safety. It's for your own good, it's for your safety. We're going to protect you. And the more freedoms you give up, the tighter the noose becomes. And then at a certain point, there's no more camping for you, and maybe not for anybody else either. I think to some extent there's a sort of Peter Pan syndrome happening, and we don't want to grow up. We don't want to face up to what is happening. And so we end up in this constant cycle of virtue signaling and something like baby talk. Democracy is under attack in BC. It's not an exaggeration. It's under attack at the national, the federal level in Canada. Mark Carney is sitting as prime minister, and he's hasn't lived in Canada for 10 or 11 years. He holds 3 passports. Uh, and he wasn't even elected to Parliament. He was not a member of Parliament. He was the former governor of the Bank of Canada, and then he was the governor of the Bank of England. He represents international banking interests. He was lobbying the mayor of Beijing a week before taking up office as Prime Minister of Canada. These things, together with crushing the lawful protest in Ottawa, and that's another bizarre thing. A lot of Canadians think, oh, they occupied Ottawa. That was terrible. There was a peaceful protest that has been described by, I know many, many people who spent a good deal of time there. They went there and served food there, and they described it as a kind of Canada Day celebration, and in the most positive terms imaginable. And all of the footage taken on the ground, not by mainstream media, but all the footage I've seen, it really was an uplifting thing. And there were 2 rulings, 2 Ontario judge rulings during the protest, that in which the judge mentions, I've forgotten his name, mentions that the protest is awful. And you know, so stripping Canadians' rights to dissent and crushing that protest, that sends a very clear message to Canadians. And then going after Tamara Lich and Chris Barber on mischief charges, holding them in prison for years. If you commit murder in Canada, you can be out on bail. But here you've got these 2 individuals who stood up for all Canadians, even if many Canadians don't recognize that. It's a very important thing to have the right to refuse unwanted medical interventions. And it's a very important thing to have the right to refuse medical experimentation to which one has not consented. These are non-derogable rights. These can't be suspended even in wartime. And the truckers, it was amazing that they were able to maintain order and peaceful order throughout the protest. When you look at the book by Ray McGuinness, Unjustified, the Freedom Convoy, the Emergencies Act, and the Inquiry That Got It Wrong, he brings together a great deal of information there. And I recommend that as a resource for all Canadians. But one of the things that you discover is that we have a public record from the inquiry, and from the Ontario Police Service, from CSIS, we have no record of any property damage committed by protesters. We have no record of any violence. This is the most peaceful and orderly protest ever. And I remember, oddly, the extreme irony of it is, it's so bizarre, but while my mother was still here, she was having a discussion with another elderly woman, and that woman had been watching the CBC, and she was really upset about the protesters. And of course, the CBC was reporting things that have since been revealed as falsehoods about the nature of the protest and the protesters. But this woman said, "Oh, if I was there, and they were honking their horns, I'd want to put a bomb underneath their trucks." And well, no, just no. Uh, you know, protests are meant to be inconvenient, and protest is absolutely necessary in a democracy because it clearly demonstrates that the voices of the people are not being heard. And this is recourse to something that is not violent rebellion. This is still working with the government. And what did those protesters want? They wanted to meet with government, and government wouldn't. This was a failure of governance in Canada. And when the injunction was passed by the Ontario court judge, the protesters followed it. Oddly, the only acts of property damage during the protest were committed by anti-protest protesters, people dressed all in black, supposedly Antifa, who cut air horn lines and slashed some of the tires of the trucks. And so each block had to put out a person to keep watch. And then I think in one instance, they stopped someone who was damaging the trucks, and the police took that person into custody. And then in the morning, the media reported that there had been property damage, and they left it to the readers to assume that was the protesters doing that. But no, in fact, it was people damaging the trucks. And in one other instance, the residents in an apartment building threw things on the trucks. And I don't think any charges were laid, but this too, Canadians need to begin to actually consider what it means when someone takes the truckers do not have. When you think of a trucker, you don't think, well, this person probably has a few $100,000 just sitting in the bank. They can take time off work. They're traveling across the country at great expense, and they are participating in a protest that garnered international attention and sympathy, and for a very good cause. This is something that is incredibly admirable, and wishing violence upon them that's not an appropriate response. And why you'd think, well, what on earth are people thinking to even say something like that? And well, they're following an example. They're following the example of people like John Horgan and Bonnie Henry. Bonnie Henry saying, I don't have any time for healthcare workers who don't want to be vaccinated. Well, a healthcare worker understands that before you administer any kind of treatment, there needs to be informed consent. And they can see if they're not able to provide the information requisite for informed consent to patients, obviously they don't have it either. And so they can't give their own informed consent. It only makes sense for healthcare workers to say no. It only makes sense for physicians to say no. But in Canada, they didn't. They just went along with it. And they went along with it because they were told it was the right thing to do. Don't be selfish. Think of others. After all, you're a doctor. Yes, but part of being a doctor, a physician, or a nurse is you are responsible for safeguarding the rights of your patients. And the first most important element there is to guarantee informed consent. Any healthcare worker knows that they were not able to provide the information required for informed consent. And so then they couldn't possibly give it themselves. So why did they? Well, we could say there's some motivated thinking here. There's a high level of motivation to not to consider that little point, even though it's so central to medical ethics. And you see something with our judges. There appears to be, a great deal of motivation not to consider rights infringements, charter protected rights infringements. This is ludicrous. Your judges, I mean, this is an incredibly privileged group of people. They're paid incredibly well. The benefits to the employment package, it's unparalleled. And so you can understand why judges might have been inclined to err on the side of safety. They were visited in Canada, across Canada, particularly in BC, but across Canada, by Action Committee on Court Proceedings during COVID-19. And David Eby was part of that at the BC level and at the federal level. At the federal level, you had Supreme Court Justice Richard Wagner and David Lametti, Attorney General. And, this Judicial Action Committee, it went around and it gave advice to the courts and on how they ought to conduct themselves to maintain access to the courts throughout the pandemic. And that's laudable. And but oddly, we all remember being subjected to a fear campaign. You've got to get vaccinated because otherwise you'll spread it to others. You'll spread it to granny. Well, our judges were subjected to that same fear campaign. You have to toe the line. You have to promote. You have to promote the mainstream narrative. You have to go along with this, because otherwise, a greater number of people will die. They're depending on you. And I mean, I'm paraphrasing wildly here, but unlike us, our judges, the Judicial Action Committee brought in the flesh representatives from the Public Health Agency of Canada who spoke to them and assured them of the gravity of the situation and presented the latest epidemiology and modeling at the monthly meetings, first weekly, then bi-weekly, then monthly meetings. And so motivated thinking in that case, what did it do? Well, when you look at the minutes from these meetings, you see a pattern, and you see, and part of the pattern is the PHAC representative, Cindy Evans. She seems to maintain a constant sort of pressure that we need to maintain the measures in place, whether or not the case numbers, hospitalizations, UCI, whether or not these numbers are rising or falling. We really need to maintain the measures in place. And, when the numbers fall, there's always some new element that's concerning, like now children. We're seeing greater numbers of children who are showing up as cases, or we're concerned with the 18 to 29-year-old demographic. But what's absent from these minutes is any indication that these judges examined the information being brought by PHAC. Any indication that they posed questions regarding the possible implication of the vaccine rollout in the spike in cases among younger people. There's no questioning that is recorded in the minutes whether or not when we see unvaccinated cases, whether these include a great number of people who were in fact vaccinated within the last 2 weeks. Because the way in which hospitals recorded vaccination status was, if you had been vaccinated in the last 2 weeks, you were counted as an unvaccinated person. So that would mean that the vaccine injured who are showing up in the hospitals, if they did, would be counted as unvaccinated. And if they did have an injury, it would probably show up within that 2-week period. Whether intentional or unintentional, this is this is a problem. And that's the type of problem you'd expect the critical minds within our judiciary to seize upon and get to the bottom of. So, the Judicial Action Committee went around and it went around to the courts, and it made sure that the judges they were served in person the same kind of message that regular Canadians received through the media, and that is, this is a crisis, and we just have to put aside any question of individual freedoms in order to protect the majority. We've got a one-size-fits-all answer, and we're going to ask you to consider the collective well-being over the selfish interests of the individual. The trick there is, if you get your judges to do that, then what you're getting them to overlook is not really selfishness of individuals, but the rights and freedoms of individuals upon which democracy is based. So that happened, and it's still happening. And the difference is that now we don't have a state of emergency. What we have is these big bills, legislation coming through, where the suspension, these infringements of rights, the rights violations, the possibility for their continuance without any oversight, without any possibility of remedy, is being written into the legislation so that there doesn't have to be an emergency declared to suspend your rights. The possibility is always there for our elected representatives, but more importantly for the appointees who will administer the elaborate edifice set in motion and erected by this legislation. So the Emergency and Disaster Management Act, the Health Professions and Occupations Act, and the Legal Professions Act, these are an outright attack in BC on democracy. They're a complete flaunting of established democratic lawmaking. And I mentioned getting away from baby talk. Well, for a judge, judges have to begin considering the fact that they have stood by and allowed the infringing of rights and freedoms, that they're the guarantors. They're the ones who are there to protect rights-based rule of law democracy. And in order to do that, they need to remain independent. The independence of the judiciary is important. And so what they've been doing is they've been deferring to the authority of the executive branch extended in the administrative state. So just one agency, PHAC, Public Health Agency of Canada, comes to the judges, gives them information. Well, what does a judge do in a courtroom? What happens in a courtroom? Evidence is given and it's cross-examined. It's examined. There's no real examination of the evidence given by PHAC. And that is a problem, because the judges are not there to promote the administration of government policy. They're there to review it and ensure that rights aren't infringed. They're not there to promote the general welfare of the population when it infringes rights. They're there to ensure that the rule of law continues to apply. They can't do that when they're deferring to other branches of government. So, of course, you could say that, well, there's no real judicial independence. This is just an idea. It doesn't really matter if it's just an idea. It's an idea, it's a rule, it's a guide. As much as possible, judges need to strive for independence in their decisions, and their decisions need to be anchored not to the interests of various lobbyists, but they have to be anchored to their primary function within parliamentary democracy as guarantors of rights-based rule of law. Sorry, Payman, I do ramble on. I hope that I have, covered some of what you wanted me to cover.
Dr. Cockle, you might be verbose, but you're on point and you're articulate and you're intelligent. So no apologies necessary. However, we've come to the end of the episode, and I don't want to be one of those like Debbie Downer shows. So I like to leave with a message of hope. Tell me what you see that's hopeful, that's positive change in Canada, something beautiful you see in this country. Like, let's leave the people with a positive message. Not to say that your message was negative earlier. It was very on point. But
well, I'm here in the Kootenays, and one of the things that distinguishes the Kootenays from much of British Columbia is there's a tremendous amount of local initiatives here. Everything from communal housing to alternative education, and I think that local initiatives are incredibly important. And if we want to see a difference, we need to not look to charismatic leaders. It doesn't really matter what they're doing. What matters is that we get involved with things that matter to us here. So and there are people here who are involved in trying to protect the water sources, and there are people who are going to all of the regional district meetings and making sure that there's transparency, making sure that the people who are voting on legislation here at the municipal level, that they actually have read it. So if they get a 200-page document the night before and they vote in the morning, that's not acceptable. And so you have these citizens who are showing up at these meetings and calling them out. And that's a very important thing. Whether you get involved with your local library, or whether you get involved with on your city council, or you get involved on the school board, local involvement is incredibly important. And I think also we need local communal involvement. Don't wait for the municipality to do it. You start your own initiatives. And and that includes press. I think that we need to get people, we need small presses. We need small presses in communities, and we need them to be independent. They can't all be owned by Post Media. That doesn't help. So I think local initiatives, they're incredibly important, and we're seeing a lot of them here. And a lot of people show up and they listen to constitutional lawyers like Paul Jaffe, or lawyers who are familiar and working with constitutional problems. I'm not sure whether he is officially a constitutional lawyer, but when he gives a talk, there are a lot of interested people who show up. And now we have to figure out, okay, you're informing yourself. Now let's all take steps, as they are doing here, to engage with elected representatives, to hold them to account. Otherwise, representative democracy it appears to be failing. So we need to support it, right? The public sphere, I guess this is the last idea I'll touch on. People like to say, well, government doesn't do anything right, whether it's BC Hydro, whether it's CBC. This is the public sphere. These are public institutions. You and I own them. if they're not if they're not behaving correctly, the CBC is clearly not doing what it ought to do. But that doesn't mean we scrap it and we go with private media. Post media isn't doing any better. What we need is we need to take it back. They're taken, right now they're being taken from us. We take that back, and we need to take back the public sphere. Right? These public institutions can work for us again, but we have to make them. Anyway, thanks, Payman.
Sorry, I was laughing there because as soon as you criticize private media, your internet cut out.
Oh, right.
That was funny.
Nice.
All right. Well, Dr. Cockle, thank you very much for coming on. This is the second time you've been on, and it was absolutely amazing. You're just very articulate, very intelligent. So thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks a lot, Payman.
Bye, and goodbye to the audience, and goodbye, Prairie. Stop saying I'm a advocate of Irish goodbyes. All right, I see you there. You're a fantastic audience. Goodbye, everyone.